New York City, October 1988. The Rainbow Room atop Rockefeller Center was glittering with Manhattan's elite. The American Cinema Foundation was hosting their annual gala, honoring international contributions to film. Michael Caine was there to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his impact on both British and American cinema. But the evening would be remembered not for the accolades, but for what happened when media mogul Richard Sterling decided to make his introduction of Caine into a public humiliation. Sterling was one of the most powerful men in American entertainment. His media empire included 3 television networks, a major film studio, and dozens of magazines. He was also notorious for his cruelty, his ability to destroy careers with a single phone call, and his particular disdain for what he called working-class pretenders in Hollywood. The trouble began during the cocktail hour. Sterling, already several drinks in, was holding court near the bar, surrounded by sycophants and industry executives who hung on his every word. "You know what's wrong with actors today?" Sterling was saying, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of a man who owned most of the people listening to him. "They think coming from poverty gives them authenticity, like suffering somehow makes them better artists." He took another sip of his whiskey, warming to his theme. Take tonight's honoree, Michael Caine. Classic example. Grew up poor in London, father abandoned the family, mother worked as a charlady, and he never lets you forget it. Every interview, every acceptance speech, it's always about his humble beginnings. Several people in Sterling's circle shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of casual celebrity gossip that usually filled these gatherings. This was something meaner, more personal. "I mean, I understand it's good publicity," Sterling continued. "The rags to riches story plays well with audiences, but at some point you'd think he'd develop enough class to stop trading on his mother's embarrassment." The comment hit like a slap. Several people in the group looked genuinely shocked. Attacking an actor's career choices was one thing, but bringing their family into it crossed a line that most people, even in Hollywood's brutal hierarchy, understood shouldn't be crossed. Michael Caine, who had been talking quietly with Sidney Poitier across the room, heard his name mentioned and glanced over. He couldn't hear the specific words, but he could see the body language, the cruel laughter from Sterling's group, the uncomfortable expressions on some faces. "Excuse me, Sidney," Caine said politely, and began walking toward the bar. Sterling, oblivious to Caine's approach, was still talking. "The worst part is how he talks about his mother, like she was some kind of saint, a cleaning lady who raised him in the slums. Very touching, very dramatic. But let's be honest, she was just another working-class woman who couldn't keep her husband around and couldn't provide for her children properly." That was when Caine reached the edge of the group. "I'm sorry," Caine said quietly, his distinctive voice cutting through Sterling's monologue like a blade. "Were you talking about my mother?" The group around Sterling went dead silent. Several people stepped back, sensing danger. Sterling himself turned around slowly, a smug smile still playing on his lips. "Michael, just the man we were discussing. I was telling everyone about your inspiring background." "Were you?" Caine's voice remained calm, but anyone who knew him could hear the edge underneath. Sterling's smile widened. He was drunk enough to be fearless, powerful enough to think himself untouchable. "Just that you've built quite a career on the sympathy factor. The poor boy whose mother scrubbed floors to keep food on the table, very moving story. Great publicity." The nearby conversations had stopped. People were turning to watch, sensing that something significant was happening. "I see," Caine said. "And you think that's inappropriate somehow?" "I think it's a bit much," Sterling replied. "At some point, successful people need to stop defining themselves by their childhood hardships. It becomes rather common." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Common. It was a loaded term, one that carried all sorts of implications about class and breeding and who belonged in elite circles. Caine looked at Sterling for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but it carried clearly across the suddenly silent area of the room. "Richard, can I tell you something about my mother?" Sterling shrugged, still smiling. "Of course. Her name was Ellen Frances Marie Burchell. She was born in 1900 in South London. Her father worked in a match factory, and her mother took in washing to make ends meet." More people were gathering now, drawn by the tension and the unusual nature of the conversation. When she was 14, Ellen had to leave school to work in a laundry. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week in heat and steam that would make grown men faint. She did that for 4 years until she married my father. Caine's voice remained steady, factual, as if he were reciting historical information. My father left when I was 3 years old. No explanation, no goodbye, just disappeared one day and never came back. Ellen was suddenly alone with 2 young children and no income. Sterling's smile was beginning to fade. She could have put us in an orphanage. That's what most women in her situation did. The system was set up for it, and no one would have blamed her. But she didn't. Caine took a step closer to Sterling. Instead, she took any work she could find. She cleaned offices, scrubbed floors, washed dishes in restaurants. Sometimes she worked 3 jobs in one day. She'd leave before dawn and come home after we were asleep, and she did it every single day for 15 years. The room around them had gone completely quiet. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Do you know what charladies means, Richard? It means a woman who cleans other people's homes and offices for a few shillings a week. It means getting on your hands and knees to scrub toilets and floors for people who won't even look at you, who treat you like you're invisible. Sterling was no longer smiling. Something in Caine's tone and the quiet intensity of his delivery had penetrated even his alcohol-fueled arrogance. My mother did that work with dignity because it meant her children could eat, could have clothes, could stay in school. She sacrificed her health, her social life, any chance of remarrying or having a better life, so that my brother and I could have opportunities she never had. Caine's voice was getting stronger now, more passionate but still controlled. When I got my first role in a West End play, she spent her entire savings, £3, 10 shillings, to buy a dress so she could come to opening night. She sat in the cheapest seats in the house, but she was there. When I won my first major film role, she cried. Not because she was proud of the glamour or the money, but because she knew I would never have to clean other people's toilets to survive. Sterling looked like he wanted to escape, but he was trapped by the crowd that had gathered around them. You called her just another working-class woman who couldn't keep her husband around and couldn't provide for her children properly, Caine continued. But you're wrong about everything except the working-class part. His voice took on an edge of steel. She provided for her children better than most wealthy parents provide for theirs, not with money or opportunities or advantages, but with something more valuable, the understanding that dignity comes from how you treat other people, not from how other people treat you. The crowd was completely transfixed. This wasn't just a celebrity confrontation, it was something deeper, more personal. Every role I've ever played, every choice I've made in my career has been guided by something she taught me, that where you come from doesn't matter as much as where you're going, but you should never forget the people who helped you get there. Caine looked directly at Sterling. So when I talk about my mother in interviews, when I mention her sacrifices in acceptance speeches, I'm not trading on her embarrassment. I'm honoring her courage. I'm making sure that people know that Michael Caine didn't spring fully formed from the London theater scene, that everything I accomplished was built on the foundation of her selflessness. Sterling's face had gone pale. The crowd around them was absolutely silent. And you know what the most remarkable thing about her was? Caine continued. Despite everything she went through, despite being abandoned and struggling and working jobs that broke her body and spirit, she never became bitter. She never spoke ill of my father. She never complained about her circumstances. She just kept working, kept loving us, kept believing that things would get better. His voice softened slightly. She died in 1979, when I was finally successful enough to make her life comfortable. I bought her a little house, hired someone to help with cooking and cleaning, made sure she could spend her final years without worry. But do you know what she was proudest of? Sterling shook his head slightly. Not that her son had become a movie star. Not that she didn't have to work anymore. She was proudest that I still came to visit her every week, that I never acted like I was too important to sit in her kitchen and drink tea and listen to her stories about the neighborhood. The emotion in Caine's voice was unmistakable now. That's what you don't understand, Richard. When I talk about my mother, I'm not asking for sympathy or trying to score points with audiences. I'm trying to make sure that people understand that success doesn't happen in isolation. That behind every person who achieves something significant, there are usually other people who sacrifice to make that achievement possible. He paused, letting that sink in. And those people, the cleaning ladies and factory workers and single mothers who hold families together through sheer force of will. They deserve to be remembered and honored, not dismissed as common by people who inherited their advantages. Sterling stood there, trapped and exposed, as Caine continued. You talk about my mother's embarrassment, but the only embarrassing thing in this conversation is your complete inability to recognize heroism when it's described to you. My mother was a hero, not in the dramatic movie hero sense, but in the real sense. She saved 2 children from poverty and hopelessness through her own sacrifice and determination. Caine's voice took on a tone of quiet authority. That's not common, Richard. That's extraordinary. And the fact that you can't see the difference says everything about your character and nothing about hers. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling looked around the crowd, perhaps hoping for support, but found only uncomfortable faces and averted eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice much quieter than before. I didn't mean to disparage your mother's memory. Yes, you did, Caine replied simply. That's exactly what you meant to do. You meant to diminish her memory to make me look like a fraud who trades on sob stories for career advancement. Sterling opened his mouth to protest, but Caine held up a hand. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? It was a direct challenge, delivered quietly but unmistakably. Sterling could continue to defend his comments, could try to laugh it off, could storm away, or he could do something that powerful men rarely did: admit he was wrong. The crowd waited. This was a moment that could define not just the evening but potentially careers and relationships throughout the industry. Sterling looked down at his drink, then back at Caine. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. You're right. What I said was cruel and unfair. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, and I had no right to speak about her that way. It wasn't enough. Caine waited, his expression unchanging. I apologize, Sterling continued. Louder now. To you and to your mother's memory. What I said was wrong. Caine nodded slightly but still didn't speak. Sterling seemed to understand that more was required. He took a deep breath and looked around the crowd that had gathered. I want everyone here to know that I spoke carelessly and cruelly about Michael's family. His mother was clearly a woman of extraordinary strength and character, and she deserves respect, not ridicule. I'm sorry for my comments, and I'm grateful to Michael for setting me straight. The crowd remained silent, absorbing what they had just witnessed. Richard Sterling, one of the most powerful men in American media, had just publicly apologized for insulting a dead working-class woman. Caine extended his hand to Sterling, who shook it gratefully. Thank you, Caine said simply. I think she would have appreciated that. As the crowd began to disperse and conversations resumed, the dynamic of the evening had fundamentally changed. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the gala, and by the time Caine gave his acceptance speech later that evening, everyone knew about his defense of his mother's memory. His speech was brief and gracious, but he concluded with words that resonated with everyone who had witnessed or heard about the earlier confrontation. Success in this industry often makes us forget where we came from and who helped us get here. Tonight reminded me that forgetting those people isn't just ungrateful, it's untrue to who we really are. So I dedicate this award to Ellen Frances Marie Burchell and to all the parents who sacrifice everything so their children can dream bigger dreams. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Richard Sterling never spoke publicly about Michael Caine again. He became more respectful of actors from working-class backgrounds, more careful about his public comments, and more generous in his business dealings with performers who reminded him of Caine. Years later, when Sterling was asked about the incident, he would say, Michael Caine taught me that night that privilege isn't just about what you can afford to do, it's about what you can afford to understand. I couldn't afford to understand his mother's sacrifice because I'd never had to make one myself. That was my limitation, not his. If you've ever had your family or background dismissed by someone who thinks their advantages make them superior, if you've ever been told that honoring your roots is somehow beneath your current status, Michael Caine's defense of his mother reminds us that there's no shame in remembering where you came from, that the people who sacrifice for our success deserve to be celebrated, not hidden. And that true class isn't about forgetting your past, it's about honoring the people who made your future possible. The impact of that October evening in 1988 extended far beyond the Rainbow Room. News of the confrontation spread through Hollywood within days. but it was the nature of the story that made it significant. This wasn't typical celebrity gossip about feuds or scandals. It was about values, about respect, and about the responsibility that comes with success. Entertainment reporters who covered the story found themselves focusing not on the drama of the moment but on the deeper questions it raised about class, privilege, and gratitude. Variety's headline read, "Caine defends working-class roots in public confrontation with media mogul." The Hollywood Reporter's piece was titled "The Night Hollywood Remembered Its Conscience," but the most powerful response came from ordinary people who heard the story. Within weeks, Michael Caine began receiving letters from fans who shared their own stories about parents who had sacrificed for their children's success. Teachers, nurses, factory workers, single mothers, all writing to thank him for honoring the kind of quiet heroism that usually goes unrecognized. One letter, from a young actress named Maria Santos, particularly moved him. "My mother cleaned houses for 20 years to pay for my acting classes. She never complained, never asked for credit, just quietly made my dreams possible. When I got my first role on a soap opera, I was embarrassed to mention her work in interviews. After hearing about what you said to Richard Sterling, I realized I was ashamed of the wrong person. Thank you for reminding me that my mother is the real star in my story." The incident also sparked conversations within the industry about the pressure actors felt to reinvent their backgrounds for public consumption. Many performers had been advised by agents and publicists to downplay humble origins, to create more glamorous backstories that would appeal to aspirational audiences. After Caine's confrontation with Sterling, this began to change. Actors started speaking more openly about their family's struggles and sacrifices. The authenticity that Caine had defended became fashionable, but more importantly, it became acceptable. Director Steven Spielberg, who had worked with Caine on several films, spoke about the incident at a Directors Guild event. What Michael did that night wasn't just defend his mother, he defended truth. In an industry built on illusion, he reminded us that our real stories, our authentic experiences, are what give our work meaning. The change was particularly noticeable among younger performers. Rising stars who might have previously hidden their working-class backgrounds began incorporating them into their public personas, not as marketing tools but as integral parts of their identities. Actor John Travolta, whose own father had been a tire salesman, said in a 1989 interview, "Michael Caine showed us that success doesn't require amnesia. You can become successful without becoming ashamed of where you started." Richard Sterling himself underwent a transformation that surprised many who knew him. The public humiliation he had experienced seemed to trigger a genuine period of self-reflection. Within 6 months of the incident, he had established a foundation providing scholarships for children from low-income families to attend performing arts schools. The foundation's mission statement read in part, "Every child deserves the chance to dream, regardless of their family's economic circumstances." This foundation honors the parents who sacrifice to make those dreams possible, recognizing that their contributions are the true foundation of artistic excellence. When asked about his motivation for creating the foundation, Sterling was uncharacteristically humble. "I realized that night that I had spent my entire career benefiting from other people's talents while dismissing the circumstances that created those talents. Michael Caine's mother represents thousands of parents who sacrifice everything for their children's success. This foundation is my way of acknowledging their importance." The foundation went on to provide scholarships for more than 5,000 students over the next 2 decades. Many of its recipients went on to successful careers in entertainment, and several specifically mentioned Ellen Burchell in their acceptance speeches, having learned her story through the foundation's literature. Michael Caine himself became more intentional about using his platform to honor working-class contributions to the arts. He began speaking regularly at schools in working-class neighborhoods, always emphasizing that success didn't require abandoning your origins. "The best actors I know," he would tell students, "are the ones who remember what it felt like to struggle, to hope, to depend on someone else's love and sacrifice. Those experiences don't disqualify you from success. They're what make your success meaningful." He also established a tradition of dedicating his award acceptances to working-class parents, not just his own mother but the collective sacrifices of all families who supported their children's artistic ambitions. This practice influenced other actors, and by the 1990s it had become common for performers to acknowledge their family's contributions in acceptance speeches. The ripple effects extended to how the media covered celebrity backgrounds. Entertainment journalists began asking different questions in interviews, focusing on family influences and early inspirations rather than just career achievements. The stories that emerged painted a richer picture of success, one that acknowledged the community effort behind individual achievement. Talk show hosts started inviting not just celebrities but their family members as guests, giving platforms to the parents and relatives whose stories had previously been relegated to brief mentions in biographies. Ellen Burchell became something of a posthumous icon, representing all the unnamed heroes who enabled their children's success. In 1992, 4 years after the confrontation, Caine was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell his mother's story. Ellen's England became a critically acclaimed film that used Ellen Burchell's life as a lens through which to examine working-class experience in 20th century Britain. The documentary featured interviews with dozens of other actors, directors, and entertainers who shared stories about their own parents' sacrifices. What emerged was a collective portrait of the hidden foundation of artistic success, the ordinary people whose extraordinary dedication made extraordinary careers possible. When the documentary premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, Caine was asked about his decision to participate in such a personal project. "My mother's story isn't unique," he said. "It's universal. Every successful person has an Ellen Burchell in their background. Someone who sacrificed, someone who believed, someone who made success possible through their own selflessness. This film is for all of them." The documentary won several awards and became required viewing in many film schools, not just for its artistic merit but for its examination of the social context of creative achievement. It helped establish a new understanding of success as a collaborative effort rather than an individual accomplishment. Richard Sterling's transformation continued throughout the 1990s. He became known for his mentorship of young executives from diverse backgrounds, and his media companies began actively recruiting from working-class communities. In 1995, he endowed a chair at Columbia Journalism School specifically for the study of class and economic inequality in media representation. In his endowment speech, he said, "I spent most of my career believing that my privilege was earned rather than inherited, that my advantages were evidence of my superiority rather than my luck. Michael Caine helped me understand that privilege is only meaningful when it's used to expand opportunities for others." The Sterling Chair became one of the most prestigious positions in journalism education, producing scholars and reporters who brought new perspectives to coverage of economic inequality and social mobility. When Ellen Burchell's centenary was marked in 2000, several major newspapers ran retrospective pieces about her life and its impact on her famous son's career. But the articles also explored the broader phenomenon she had come to represent, the uncelebrated heroism of working parents who sacrifice for their children's dreams. Michael Caine, now 67 and reflecting on a career spanning 5 decades, was asked by the Times of London what his mother would have thought of her posthumous fame. "She would have been embarrassed by the attention," he said with a smile. "But I think she would have been pleased that her story helped people understand that success isn't just about individual talent, it's about family love, community support, and the willingness of one generation to sacrifice for the next." The legacy of that confrontation in 1988 continues to influence how success is understood and celebrated in the entertainment industry. Awards shows now routinely feature tributes to families and communities that support artistic achievement. Scholarship programs for students from working-class backgrounds have become standard parts of industry philanthropy. Most importantly, the idea that honoring your background is somehow common or inappropriate has largely disappeared from public discourse. Instead, authenticity about origins has become a valued quality both in artistic work and in public life. When Michael Caine was knighted in 2000, he used his acceptance speech to once again honor his mother's memory. "This knighthood belongs as much to Ellen Burchell as it does to me. She taught me that nobility isn't about titles or recognition. It's about how you treat other people, especially when no one is watching. That lesson has guided every choice I've made in my career and my life." The lesson remains relevant today, that success without gratitude is empty, that achievement without acknowledgement of those who made it possible is incomplete. Michael Caine's defense of his mother that October evening wasn't just about family loyalty, it was about the fundamental truth that we are all products of love, sacrifice, and community support. and that recognizing this truth, far from diminishing our accomplishments, makes them more meaningful by connecting them to the larger human story of which we are all a part.